Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 158, Curating the Jewish Story. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And we are here for the third of 5 interviews on the subject of creativity that we are putting together with a partner, the Council of American Jewish Museums, which is having a conference in Los Angeles in about a week. The first 3 guests that we've had in this series, Aaron Henney, Yishai Hussedman, and today's guest, Ivy Barsky, are going to appear together on a panel at the conference. It's the first time that we're going to have a chance to have guests on Judaism Unbound interact with each other and deepen the conversation after spending some time with us on the show. We're going to release the audio of that panel very quickly after it happens on March 3rd, and we look forward to hearing from you whether the interaction between our guests added something new to your experience of Judaism Unbound. We're thinking about doing events like this with other partners. We're thinking about potential live events in the future. So we'd love to have your feedback on how this works. So let's introduce today's guest. Ivy Barsky is the CEO and Gwen Goodman Director of the National Museum of American Jewish History, which is an affiliate of the Smithsonian Institution. The mission of the National Museum of American Jewish History is to present educational programs and experiences that preserve, explore, and celebrate the history of Jews in America. Its purpose is to connect Jews more closely to their heritage and to inspire in people of all backgrounds a greater appreciation for the diversity of the American Jewish experience and the freedoms to which Americans aspire. Ivy Barsky has been the CEO of the museum since 2012. Prior to that, she was the chief operating officer of the same museum. And prior to that, she spent about a decade and a half as the deputy director of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York City. And prior to that, she served at a number of important art museums. Lex and I had an opportunity to spend some real quality time at the National Museum of American Jewish History as part of a previous collaboration with the American Jewish Historical Society. We walked through the incredible exhibits at the museum, along with a number of scholars that are affiliated with the American Jewish Historical Society, and we actually recorded short conversations about some of the artifacts in the museum. We released some of that audio a few months ago, and we're looking forward to releasing more in the weeks to come. We had a fantastic time at this incredible museum and really urge anybody to go and visit. No matter what your interests are, if you have any interest in American Jewish history, there are going to be some exhibits there that are going to really blow you away. So without further ado, let's get more inside of that museum, inside of how museum directors think and how museums may play a role in the future of American Jewish life. So Ivy Barsky, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Great to be here, Dan. Thank you.
So I think that in getting started, it would be helpful if you could give our listeners a bit of an orientation about museums. I think a lot of us have a notion that we know what a museum is, but I'm pretty sure most of us are wrong. So I was wondering if you could start by giving us a little bit of an explanation from the point of view of a museum professional as to what we should be thinking a museum is.
We're the folks who help make sense out of history and art for a broad public and really explore what it means to be human by looking at the history, the art, the music, the science, the exploration, the discovery, and the things that we create uniquely as human beings. One of the things that bind probably all museums together is that we collect for the most part. There are actually some museums and Kunsthallen, places that actually don't have collections. The Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, for example, is one such. But most of us are in the business of preserving and presenting and interpreting collections. So that's one thing. There's a preservation function that used to be the primary thing that museums did. as time has gone on and education and mindfulness about who our audiences are and developing new audiences, we've thought more about education and interpretation and how we take the history, the art, the science, whatever kind of museum we are, and interpret those messages for the public.
So could you tell us a little bit about the story of your particular museum, the National Museum of American Jewish History?
Our museum for the last 8 years has been here on Independence Mall in Philadelphia, the most important historic square mile in all of the United States, I would say. Here in dialogue with the Liberty Bell, with Independence Hall, with the National Constitution Center. So in a way, our story, which is about American Jewish history and unique in that we're telling the story of Jews in America, is really in conversation with those other founding stories here, which is a really important part of who we are, because the core exhibition is all organized around the concept of freedom, so that conversation with the rest of the mall is really present. Our story starts in 1654 when the first 23 Jews came from Recife, Brazil. And we tell the story about the founding of this country and Jews' role in the founding of the country, in every conflict, in every war since then, and really in the shaping of our democracy. We, of course, tell the story of the big waves of immigration. So we talk about small waves of immigration, but we also talk about the big waves of immigration between 1880 and 1924. And we take the story all the way up to the present. So we go through the Holocaust from an American perspective, what Americans knew and didn't know, what American Jews knew and didn't know, what our government did and didn't do. And deal with the post-war phenomenon of the surviving remnant coming to this country, of the move to the suburbs and everything that we associate with the second half of the 20th century. And we have places in the exhibition, like our Contemporary Issues Forum, where we bring the story up to the present. So our visitors, we actually have a couple of places where visitor-generated comment and discussion is integrated into the core exhibition so that it takes you up to today.
So I'm curious to ask a little bit about audience, like who are your visitors? And so I'm curious on a couple levels. First, I'm curious to the extent that you know, like sort of when the museum was in construction, who was imagined to be those who would attend? Is it Jews? Is it those who aren't Jewish? Is it certain age groups more than others? Is the idea that schools will come and learn about Jews? I'm curious who some of those audiences are. I'm sure there are multiple, but also what have you seen in practice that either is aligned or isn't aligned with what you imagined the audience might be early on, or when you started working with this museum?
I think that when they were building and we first started, there was just the sense of who would go to the Liberty Bell, and that some of them would come to us. And that obviously Jews, both from this area and Jewish tourists to Philadelphia from across the country and across the world would come. But one of the real challenges of our museum and of many museums is just what you had in your question. How do you address all those different audiences and visitors and meet them where they are, since there's going to be people with huge varieties of knowledge that they walk in with. So, we get from Jewish audiences, why don't you say anything about my town in Podunk? Or you don't say anything about the people who come from Minsk. Or, so we'll get those where everyone wants to find themselves or see themselves. So we've got to do everything to address those audiences, but also the real newbies who maybe have never met a Jew or think they've never met a Jew, who are coming in because they're interested and want to learn about what that is. And we have that. You can imagine our Philadelphia public school groups. There are, 77% of them at least of all our school groups are not Jewish. So, and they either think, or it might be true that they have not met a Jew or haven't met a Jew that they know about. So there are things that you wouldn't expect, like they don't know Albert Einstein, who you meet in our lobby exhibition, our Only in America gallery. They don't know that Albert Einstein is Jewish. So there are certain things that our more knowledgeable Jewish audience might take for granted. That's not something you have to teach anyone, but that can be very surprising. So I like to say sometimes that our museum, because we are both in Philadelphia serving a local community, but we're a national museum serving a national audience. We're also a Jewish museum serving Jews and bringing Jews closer to their own heritage with pride and knowledge of their own history here in America. But we're also serving a non-Jewish audience with varying degrees of knowledge about immigration history, Jewish history, American history. And that's both kind of the challenge and the opportunity of what we do.
You know, my wife's family comes from Minsk, so I'm a little.
Oh, there you go. See, and just for the record, we have plenty about Minsk in the exhibition. But you know, everyone's looking for their town.
Right.
If I remember right, I think the Mouskowitzes in that movie American Tail are from Minsk. I'm not sure. The little mice family. But I wanted to selfishly get autobiographical for a second. The very first Jewish professional-esque, professional Jew-esque thing I ever did, long before I ever thought I would major in Jewish studies or work for a Jewish organization, was I was in high school and we had an assignment to shadow somebody in the community doing like whatever career to like learn about somebody doing an adult job. And I grew up in Milwaukee and I shadowed a woman named Kathy Bernstein, who was the founding director of Milwaukee's Jewish Museum. And I think back to it all the time because not only did I shadow a very cool museum in the scheme of museums generally, but also in the scheme of Jewish museums. But I got to see the museum as it was being constructed. So this was actually while the museum was a bunch of like 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper scattered around a hall with certain ideas of what it would be, but no real sense. No final conclusions about what all of the pieces would be of the permanent exhibition and, of course, of all of the rotating exhibitions that would come through over the course of its years. And what that taught me was something that I've held with me ever since, which is that, museums make choices. Like museums, here they are, the Jewish Museum in Milwaukee, and there's all sorts of different ways that they could approach that work. And there's all sorts of different voices that they could center and that they could sideline. And there's all sorts of different stories that they could use as case studies and other stories that they could push aside. And there's like a lot of really challenging and big picture questions about how you even go about defining what the history, in their case, of a particular Jewish community is. But in your case, of the entire American Jewish community. I mean, that's like a lot of hard questions, like who is the American Jewish community? Who's a part of it? Is it just Jews who are Americans? Is it those who are adjacent to Jews? Is it certain rabbis taking up more space in that story than, say, a random Jew on the street? Is it all of those kinds of questions? And so I wanted to open up to you, like, what does it look like? Like, how does a museum in your shoes go about those challenging questions of like, okay, what do we prioritize here? And also, are there ever moments where you look at your permanent exhibition or what you have been placing at the forefront and think, maybe we could try a different thing too. Maybe we could experiment with some other way of going about this. Ultimately, storytelling act. It's real. I don't want to say that it's like fiction, but it is
storytelling. Absolutely. Yeah, I love that question. I hope you don't have any others because that's going to take a long time for us to get through. First of all, let's give a shout out to that Kathy Bernstein.
Yeah. And Ali Gettinger, who I also pseudo shadowed.
Excellent. I love that you were inspired by that Jewish museum in Milwaukee and that made you into a Jewish professional and engaged you. And we're going to give them all the credit and kudos because I love that. And you were so lucky to be there also while they were thinking about building it, because that's really, most of us don't get to see that piece of it. And I I came to the museum in Philadelphia after it was actually built and open to the public. We opened in November. I got here in July, but I was part of the building of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York both times in 90, whatever that was, 6 or 7, and then again in 2003. And the building of a museum is exactly that, and really deciding what the story is going to be. Not that the stories don't change, even in a core exhibition, the stories change, but really saying and having those great arguments about what stories get told and what don't. And it's called, curating, which is a word that people use for everything from craft cocktails to whatever. But we used to own that word in museums, and that's really precisely what it is. It's about making those hard choices and crafting the story. Some of the choices we make are actually driven by the material culture. So we can have great stories. If we don't have the objects, we can't tell those stories. And we don't want to be a book on the wall. So sometimes we make really hard choices. We just don't have the artifacts to tell that story. So someone's got to do it in a book or a movie, but we can't do it here well. Startifacts, star artifacts that can help carry the story. But you're absolutely right. Those choices that we make, and then what we say about them. So you can imagine, and if you're a Jewish American historian and you're writing a book, there aren't really a lot of space limits, as we know from a lot of big, fat American Jewish history books, which we're so glad that we have. It is our job to make that stuff publicly accessible, which means taking some big ideas that there might be multiple books on and writing literally a 200-word label to get the most important things across. So it's almost like shorthand, every syllable counts. And that's part of the creative process of being in this museum world. And it's also why there are many of us, because we've got different stories to tell. So we're not telling the same story as the Holocaust Museum in DC or the Jewish Museum uptown in New York. But sometimes certain stories get privileged because some great artifacts come with them. And so it is more compelling to visitors because they're here, they're standing. We need to have something beautiful.
I mean, I think that for me, at least one example, and maybe, I haven't been to the right museums or I missed it when I was there, but one example that I think a lot about and that we've talked to, for example, Jonathan Sarna about, is the idea that before the middle of the 19th century, there were no rabbis in America. And I'm really curious about what was the content of the Jewish life, the ritual, the spiritual life, or maybe there wasn't, but I'm really curious about what was the inner life like of those Jews. And it feels like rabbis tend to be the ones who write about that kind of stuff, and regular Jews didn't write so much about that stuff. And I don't know how to really understand what that was really like.
So that Jonathan Sarna was one of the academic advisors on our project. So that is something we talk about in the exhibition. So that's a really interesting example because you're talking about the lack of something, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But which wasn't seen as that there were strong Jewish communities with lay leaders, and you can imagine those leaders in the community coming forward to be the chazan or to somehow lead a service or make decisions for a Jewish community in the absence of rabbis. And I think that's pretty interesting stuff and a pretty interesting example for contemporary American Jews who were often looking for alternative ways to express their Jewishness that we don't need. And certainly many rabbis are also moving away from that kind of authoritative stance, but that it's about community. And there's something terribly American about that as well, isn't there? It's that it's very American, very democratic, I think, to say it's about the community. And we talk about those communities that existed as strong Jewish community centers and places of worship and education without having a rabbi. And then we talk about when those rabbis do start to come over. And of course, we talk about Isaac Leeser here, who, translated the Hebrew Bible into English. So those are all interesting, and probably because of Jonathan Sarna, but also because it's just a really important part of the American story. We do a pretty good job, I think, of telling those stories.
I really want to keep rolling with this thread you brought up about how sometimes you don't have objects, or like how the certain startifacts, which is a term I'm going to steal, as how certain startifacts can drive how a museum happens. And I want to look at it both optimistically and cynically, because I think that there are real pluses to that and real minuses to that. And I want to throw out like a weird analogy, which is, I think about this sometimes. Like, what if 10,000 years pass from now and some future community, the only artifact they have of 21st century American society is, I'm choosing this because it happens to be sitting next to me on my table, is a box of Girl Scout cookies. And I'm choosing that arbitrarily. It could be any object around any of us. What if the only object they had was a sweater that somebody wore? What would that one object be interpreted to say? And like, how would that be understood? And what wouldn't we find? Because, like, of course, the box of Girl Scout cookies wouldn't tell the whole story of American society. But actually, what's interesting is it would tell a lot of different things. You could look at all of the stuff in this food that is not natural. You could look at the picture of a smiling girl on the cover and what that says about gender dynamics. I mean, you could look at all sorts of these questions just from a silly box of Girl Scout cookies. And so at the same time, like, we all know that we would miss out on so much if that's all we had. And so, like, putting that into the museum context, like, ultimately you have like one or two objects for many, let's say, entire decades of American Jewish history sometimes. And if we were talking about a different museum, let's say like a history museum that was looking at ancient civilization, they have an even bigger uphill battle because they might have to capture an entire couple centuries or an entire era with just a few objects. So I'm curious, like, do you ever go to sleep at night with existential angst around like, oh my gosh, is this misrepresenting history? Are we missing some pieces? And at the same time, like, how powerful is it and how cool is it that we can actually learn a lot from something analogous to a box of Girl Scout cookies from a few hundred years ago?
So I hope they're Thin Mints, by the way.
They are peanut butter patties. So the people in the country wouldn't know that there's also tagalongs that are a warring Girl Scout cookie brand that.
That's right, which they wouldn't know. They would have no way of knowing that. Think of what's lost to history. Yes, I do stay up at night and have existential angst, but it's not about this.
Good.
But I think that we have media, we have interactives, we have crowdsourced and user-generated content. We have other ways to tell the story or surround the story. And we rely on those archaeologists, museums do, not only us, historians, archivists, to find that stuff and distill those stories, even if we don't have the material culture, to find a way to talk about those stories. So it's interesting to think about the fact that often the objects that survive and we get to show in the museum are the ones that people thought were very important and important enough to save. So it's interesting sometimes when we're trying to collect objects that you can't just say, oh, you're from here, you're from there. Do you have anything? Did you save anything from those days? Because most people will say, oh, no, I don't have anything that's, museum worthy. But they don't know what they have that's museum worthy. They could have a ticket from their grandfather coming on the boat, whatever, right, from Minsk. And we can shape that whole story around that ticket. And actually, once we have the ticket, we can probably find the ship manifest. We can learn a whole lot about the circumstances under which that person left, arrived here, who he was with. Obviously the big story is often stories of pogroms and, of course, the story of the Holocaust, where so much was lost that each object really has to carry a lot of weight, and those objects are the witnesses to history, so they become kind of doubly, triply, profoundly important. And we get that and talk about that too.
I'm intrigued by the objects that survive thread, by the idea of these don't always survive accidentally. I posed the Girl Scout thing, but sometimes it's not just that a random box of Girl Scout cookies might survive. It's that people prioritized certain objects, and that's why they survived. And I'm thinking and analogizing this a little bit to like Jewish history or the Jewish corpus, looking back at what survives Jewishly, like which rituals survive, which holidays that people mark survive and continue to be commemorated in the future. And what I'm thinking about is I'm flashing to like the high holidays. And for me, consistently, what ends up sticking with me after the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is Tashlich, is the part where I literally take bread and like throw it in a river. Because there is an object involved. There's like an actual tangible thing that I'm doing and an activity associated with it. And so that sticks with me in a way that all of the words that I read and all of the songs that I sang don't stick with me. And it's flashing me back to some recent conversations we've had with a variety of guests about sort of the dichotomy of substance and words. We spoke with a guest, Ruby Namdar, who talked about how like the ancient temple sacrifices, we might write them off as like antiquated and backwards or whatever, but actually there was something beautifully tangible about this process and something that took a variety of ideas about sin and atonement, etc., and like made it into stuff. And I think museums can play a similar role, and they can take entire concepts or trends in history and distill them into like pictures and videos and like actual stuff, which may stick with somebody better than like a lesson that they hear. So I was curious to hear from you on that front. What is it maybe that makes a startifact? Like what makes an object likely to be conducive to that process in people, that it will stick? And maybe if you can, if there's one or two examples in your museum that can help us understand this, that'd be great as well.
So, well, what you say is interesting, because I think there are a lot of people who would say the artifact or the three-dimensional object is what they remember and is their touchstone, literally. And I think others would say it's the words and the experience of having been there, and the object really just unleashes that memory. And it's pretty interesting in Jewish life, since the words are so important, that there's something a little bizarre about the project of Jewish museums, because we're not just a big pile of books, which we could be if we wanted to, you know. So these startifacts, you know, well, the most important object in our whole museum, which is on long-term loan, I think you know, is the letter that between Moses Seixas and George Washington, and Washington's response to the Hebrew congregation in Newport in 1790. That exchange is a really profound exchange. And those are words. And we could teach those words, and other places do. But to have Moses Seixas's letter next to George Washington's letter for visitors to see and read while they're there, to see those words, to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Wow. Sometimes the power of those kind of artifacts, and those are, you know, associated with no less than George Washington, right? So you get this real sense of having the real thing. The words are really what's important, but the power of having the real thing is incredible. Right across from that letter is the Richmond prayer. Again, it's a piece of paper, right? It's the prayer in Richmond. It's for the President of the United States. So it's basically the prayer for the country that we all read in our prayer books now, right? But here there's an acrostic so that George Washington's name goes down the side of the page in Hebrew, and it's a prayer for the country. And just seeing that artifact just says everything about how grateful that Richmond congregation was, how greatly invested they were in their Americanness, that they wanted to pray every week for the leaders of our country. And so this is the kind of thing where you can talk about it and you can say, but when you see it and it's there in front of you, it has the power of what that must be, what that must have been and meant for that congregation in Richmond in the 18th century, right? When you have a letter, Dan and I were talking about a letter we had in our Leonard Bernstein exhibition that was a letter of recommendation from Bernstein's home rabbi to Harvard, to get him into Harvard. And we were talking about that, which was a very short reference letter. Most of us have to write, a lot to convince a school to take a person. This was Leonard Bernstein, so maybe he needed fewer words. But imagine just the very fact that he asked his rabbi to write a letter to Harvard. He had music teachers, he had teachers at Boys Latin, his fancy school that he went to. But he asked his rabbi, and he knew there was anti-Semitism at Harvard. He knew there were quotas at Harvard, and he asked his rabbi to write a letter of recommendation. So besides anything else, that one artifact with one sentence, which I just chose randomly because Dan and I happened to be talking about it, has so much story and so much depth and can mean so many things.
I'm thinking about the letter from George Washington to the synagogue, and then also thinking about the letter to George Washington that I think, the letter from George Washington that is more in our heads today because it's in the musical Hamilton, the letter of his retirement. And he actually quotes the same line from the prophets in both of those letters about every man living under his own vine and fig tree.
There shall be none to make him afraid.
There shall be none to make him afraid. And there's this sort of dual element of that, I think, that gets to what I'm trying to puzzle through here when we think about museums, which is both that in seeing those two letters directly, we also see, right, another element, which is that George Washington was very much moved by the texts that are at the basis of Judaism. And also we know that Lin-Manuel Miranda took these letters, took his encounter probably more with a book than with a museum, but turned it into what many say is the greatest piece of American art of the last 100 years or whatever, and certainly is a piece of art that speaks to our own time by invoking the past. And I guess that I've been trying to figure out how to formulate a question that really kind of comes back to the question of the mission and the purpose of museums, and maybe the mission and purpose of museums specifically in America, and maybe even more so specifically in the American Jewish community, because it feels like one of the knocks on America, let's say, and also one of its greatest strengths, has been how not backward looking it is, how it's always pushing forward, trying to, be the new world and do the new things. And I'm wondering, both historically and kind of mission-wise, has the mission of museums in America been understood to be different from the mission of museums, let's say, in Europe? And then I guess the question is why? Have people in America generally thinking of museums saying, hey, this is for you guys to get a little bit of grounding in the past because you're always trying to move forward too quickly? Or perhaps has it been a different mission that says, no, we really want to collect these things so that we can move into the future better? Or, has there been a traditional notion of what museums are supposed to do in America that's been unique to America? I guess that's question number one. And then the related question is that when we think of the American Jewish community, I guess that I worry that Judaism potentially suffers from the opposite ill that America suffers from, which is Judaism being too focused on the past and not enough focused on the creation of the new.
Well, listen, the act of creativity, depending on, whose definition you use, almost all of the definitions of creativity are about bringing disparate things together to kind of make new meaning. So it seems to me that is really the essence of maybe all Judaism, but especially Jewishness in America, has always been about invention and reinvention and putting things together differently, and what the balance is between those two, the things on the two sides of the hyphen, so the Jewish and the American, and I think all of the American Jewish Project is basically a series of acts of creation and creativity. And I think Jewish museums and Jewish artists and artists, obviously, I mean musicians, writers, are people who really connect something even in our ancient past together with something contemporary and make it all make sense. Jewish museums and the people who are doing the great work of Jewish creativity right now are the people who are looking back to move forward. We're doing an exhibition this spring on Sarah Berman's closet. So Sarah Berman came from Belarus, at some point moved to New York, a story of a journey. But then it's also a story of this woman, 60 years old, decides to leave her unhappy marriage, her very middle-class life with one suitcase in the middle of the night and goes to the village, gets herself a studio apartment and a room of her own, and recreates a life of meaning through this incredible act of courage, right, at 60 years old. One of the interesting parts of this is that Sarah Berman, who is, as you might imagine, a little eccentric, decides she's only wearing white. So the whole closet is white. White sweaters, white pants, white bras, ironed, starched, beautiful, perfect, minimalist. It's a work of art, which we will have as a freestanding sculpture on Independence Mall facing the Liberty Bell. The new idea that's going to be formed by visitors who see this opposite the Liberty Bell and are there in Philadelphia, and it'll be here over the summer, so we'll have lots of tourists, thinking about whose stories do we tell? Who's important? Who do we make monuments to? And why is this woman's white closet in the middle of Independence Mall, you know? And so that is a great, brilliant act of creativity to bring these things together, but really to present them to visitors, to tourists, to audiences, to people who are going to stumble upon it because it's right by our subway stop, who are going to stop and say, what is this and what does it mean and how does it relate to these other things? That's the creative process. It's bringing these disparate things together, and when they're together, they mean something else.
I wanted to flash, because you've mentioned a few sort of outside the box museums or ideas that could be outside the box museums. And I wanted to push on that because at one point you were talking about, like, you know, we could just have words on the wall. We could like have texts on the wall. And what would we lose? What would we gain if it was sort of words as the centerpiece as opposed to objects? I was living in Jackson for a couple of years, Jackson, Mississippi, and they have this very cool art museum. So they've made the conscious choice to have the art museum not just be an art museum that's in Jackson, Mississippi, but one that specifically reflects Jackson and has a lot about Mississippi in particular. But they have quotes all around, like you have to look upwards. They're not right with the art, but they're up above. And I don't actually know this, but I'm assuming that the quotes are very consciously placed in juxtaposition to the art pieces that are in various areas. And for me, that simple act, I would go back to the museum frequently. I mean, it was the same museum, like most of the permanent exhibition. I mean, it was the same, but I went very frequently while I lived on there because I loved doing that and sort of at different points, looking at the words versus the images and having different kinds of experience. And so I was, one day I was there and I thought to myself, and it was eerie to me because you reflected it back earlier in how you were talking. I was like, what if it was reversed? What if the museum was huge words, huge quotations on the wall, and instead of the little labels that describe the images, it was like little pictures? How would that be different? And could that actually be a cool experience? I have no idea. Maybe such things exist. I don't know. And so on one level, I'm curious about that question in particular, like words versus images, etc. But I'm also curious, like, are there examples of particularly funky outside the box museums that would push us to think of the word museum in ways that we might not already be conceiving? Because I imagine that this modality is incredibly expansive. And, you know, you talked about, you talked about an exhibition out on the streets of Philadelphia. Like, I could envision really cool museums that are out in public, not in a building structure. What are some things like that, and how should we maybe push ourselves to think of museum not in this old school way, but in a more expansive fashion?
So I think there are museums, and especially, contemporary art museums, doing great, interesting things where there are maker rooms in the same place as there are exhibitions and all that kind of stuff. I think our Jewish museum field actually has an incredible amount of innovation happening within it, especially depending on what you call a Jewish museum. So think about the Tenement Museum in New York, not only a Jewish museum, of course, and not one, I should say, that really relies on material culture. Theirs is really a museum that relies on the experience of being in that physical space with, as we said, sometimes an object or a facsimile of an artifact that is just the launch point for the story, but it's about being in that space. So that now contradicts everything we said at the beginning of this conversation, right? But what a great,
That's how we like it.
What a great place the Tenement Museum is. And they have also, they think about their mission, especially lately, in a really different way, given the political climate, about what are we saying about immigrants and what immigrants have contributed to this country, what the immigrant experience is like, and how can our visitors learn about that? And they're brilliant at that. The Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, which is, again, a fabulous place, does contemporary art exhibitions where they have one series that's called In That Case, and it's called, and then Havruta something is after the colon, I can't remember, but it's really pairing a contemporary artist with someone from another field, science or novelist or whatever, and really saying, what does that conversation do? Exactly what we're talking about. That's kind of where creativity springs from, which is putting those two disparate things together and seeing what new third thing comes out of it. So I think the Jewish museum world in particular, but the museum world in general, so it may not be just a museum that does something so terribly different as kind of programmatically or exhibition expressions or interpretations of certain things that we do in a way to bring new eyes and a new lens to this history, and that visitors are able to interpret anew something because we've just put it there for them, or put it next to something, or started a conversation of which they can be part.
I'd love to close just, I have a half thought, but also really open-ended, just to hear what you would offer as closing thoughts to our listeners about your own museum and about Jewish museums more generally. My half thought is that I have a concern that I put onto Judaism and onto sort of museums. My concern is that as Jews, we often have a danger in play of hagiography, of thinking only of that which is great about our past and pretending that everybody from our Bible characters to Talmudic rabbis to medieval Jews to recent Jews are like, we're sort of well and good. And we have a tendency, and this is a good tendency, to prioritize that which is good about our past over that which isn't good about our past. And so I have that concern about Judaism generally, but also it's a concern that can play with museums. And so I'm curious, how do you wrestle with telling the story of American Jewish history with all its warts?
Wrestle is the right word. We do wrestle with that all the time. And there are donors and others who would like us to only tell the good stories. And we also know that our audiences aren't going to trust us if they think we're not telling the whole story. So we are very mindful about making sure the whole story is out there. So as uncomfortable as it makes everyone, we tell the stories of Jewish slaveholders, for example. There is this notion, or there is some kind of notion that, all Jews were anti-slavery but they're not. And part of the lesson that we have is that Jews in the South acted much more like their Southern neighbors than their Jewish brethren in the North. And we think we need to make sure we tell those stories. So I think what you say is really important, because no one's going to trust us if they think although we get to choose what we're saying all the time, and we make, as we discussed earlier, curating is making choices. We make choices all the time. But we're so careful to make sure we get the warts and all. We do wrestle with that. Because the other thing, of course, especially now, with some rise in anti-Semitism and that coming back into the concerns, especially of our donors, to make sure that we are doing enough to combat anti-Semitism, then we have to look at, so what does that mean? How do we do that with telling the stories that we tell? My board chair, who often says our museum is not about how great we are, but how grateful we are to be American Jews. And it's a little corny, but it has the virtue of being really true. Some of the message that I would want to leave your listeners with is, first of all, go visit your local Jewish museum and your history museums and learn from the past to inform your being a citizen in a democracy, for gosh sakes. This is about really understanding how we got here and who we are and how we move forward. And the museum, a Jewish museum, is a place you can go that is not a synagogue. It's not a JCC. It's not organized Jewish life. There's nothing prescriptive about the kind of Jew you should be. You don't need Hebrew. You don't need to believe in God. You just need to be curious.
Thank you so much, Ivy Barsky, for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll listen in to the rest of these episodes on museums and creativity and art and all the ways that they intertwine. We want to close out this one by encouraging you to be in touch with us, as we always do to close our episodes. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we really deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation you can make to support us, and you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or through a one-time gift. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.